Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you tonight. Glad that you're here and we can have this time to join together in Bible study. We're starting a new study tonight, along with a new study coming up beginning Sunday morning. And both are going to be in the book of Galatians. So we're going to be doing a double dip into the book of Galatians on Sunday morning and Wednesday night. Sunday morning, we're going to go verse by verse and attack all the text in Galatians. But here in our Wednesday night class, what we want to do is look at a very important section in chapter 5. As you see up here, chapter 5, verses 19 through 21, the works of the flesh. Now, the reason we'd be studying this, of course, is because we want to know what these things are so that we can absolutely avoid these things in our lives. Let's read Galatians 5, verses 19 through 21. Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such like, of which I tell you before, as I have also told you in time past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. Of course, I'm reading the King James Version there, and so we're going to follow that order. And we're going to follow that wording. If you're reading a different translation, your translation may have slightly different words, but will be synonymous to the categories of sin that we read here in the King James Version. So just for point of reference, we will be following the King James Version in its wording and order. Just a heads up, a far out heads up, what I want to do when we get done with these verses is go immediately to the next verses that identify the fruit of the Spirit. And we'll try to spend some time on the positive side after we talk about these works of the flesh. I gave you a study guide workbook back there in the back. If you care to have those to prepare for the class, it'd be good. We can print more if we need them, but we're just going to sort of follow the format of those worksheets. First of all, I want to show you how so our first word tonight is fornication in the King James Version. Notice the King James Version calls it fornication, but the Amplified Version calls it simply immorality. The New American Standard Version calls it immorality. The New International Version calls it sexual immorality. Now, I don't know, I hope you would agree with me that these two are just entirely too vague. All kinds of things are immoral that are not fornication. Fornication, I think we all understand, involves some kind of sexual sin. Immorality, stealing, lying are immoral deeds. And so I would think that these two are just completely inadequate in translating the word the Greek word that we'll look at here in just a minute. The New International Version, and I think several other versions, will use the terminology sexual immorality. That's closer, I think. But again, I think there's some kinds of sexually immoral acts that would not fit the definition of fornication. So I want to suggest to you that I don't even think this translation is fully acceptable, that really gets to the heart of the definition. The word that we want to talk about is fornication. Now, let's see what the authorities say about that. This word comes from the Greek word porneia. And I think you can almost see in that, can't you? You see the porn part. This is the same root from which we would get pornography, okay? It's that same root word. Strong says it means harlotry. It includes adultery and incest. So stop right there. So this word can be used literally to speak of illicit sexual contact. All right? That's what a harlot would do, obviously. It's what adultery and incest would involve. Now, the word can also be used figuratively. Notice Strong says it can be used figuratively of idolatry. So, for instance, in Old Testament times, when the people of God worshiped idols, that was a form of unfaithfulness to God, right? So in a physical marriage, when one marriage partner and the other is unfaithful, commits fornication, they're unfaithful to their mate. When the Israelites worshipped idols, they were unfaithful to their God who had delivered them from Egyptian bondage. And so the word is sometimes used figuratively to describe spiritual unfaithfulness. Its primary meaning, of course, is physical unfaithfulness, or not unfaithfulness, but physical sin, involvement that's not authorized. Wait?
I was going to say, the New American Standard that you quoted, the 2020 edition, it says sexual immorality.
It includes sexual morality.
So they've updated it.
Okay. I think Vine has a really good definition. Porneia is used of illicit sexual intercourse, or metaphorically of the association of pagan idolatry with the doctrines of and professed adherence to Christian faith. And so primary meaning is of illicit sexual activity, but it can be used and is used, and we'll see some places where it's used in the New Testament, of the idea of spiritual unfaithfulness. For instance, when he says the association of pagan idols with those who profess to adhere to the Christian faith. They profess one thing, they do something else. Okay, so I think a good working definition of this sin, and we want to get a good handle on what this sin means. The word is porneia. It is unauthorized sexual activity involving actual physical contact when it's used in the physical sense. When it's used in the figurative sense, it just means unfaithfulness to God. We're supposed to be faithful to our God. And when we sin and when we engage in sinful acts, we're unfaithful to our God. And it is used in that sense too. But I really think it's important, and we're going to go to the verses that use this word. I think that it is sexual activity. It involves physical contact. And we're going to see that in the practical usage of this. Now, I guess we should go ahead and talk about why that is significant or important. It probably wouldn't have been that big of a deal a number of years ago, but we know that in our present world there's just been an explosion of pornography and access to pornography. And so in recent years, it has become an increasingly asked question. Here's a wife who discovers that her husband is addicted to pornography. He's viewing pornography. He's doing it a lot. He's done his best to keep it hidden, and he's kept it hidden for a pretty good long while. But the wife has just now discovered it, and she's uncovered the reality that he is heavily involved in viewing pornography online. And so she wants a divorce. And she wants a divorce on the basis of fornication, so that she can marry again. She wants to divorce her husband for fornication. He's been looking at pornography. Can she do that? Does the looking at pornography justify divorcing one's mate and being free then scripturally to marry another? And I think the answer to that is no, because you got to go back to the root meaning of the word. The root meaning of the word involves physical contact, real sexual activity involving physical contact. Now, that guy viewing pornography, he's sinning horribly. He's sinning against God. I think he's sinning against his wife. But it is not fornication by definition. Okay, it's a sin. It is going to actually fit more perfectly when we get later in this list of the works of the flesh. It's going to fit more perfectly under the category of lasciviousness, which is also a work of the flesh, which will also send you to hell. But it's not fornication, okay? And I think we'll see that as we look at some of the verses where we see this word used. Okay, so let's just start looking at some of the places in the Scripture where we find the word. And a lot of them are very familiar to us. This one is, and its companion verse that we'll look at right after this, Matthew 5:32. I say to you that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced, committeth adultery. Well, here's our word fornication. Of course, this is a verse that we talk about a lot because it comes to play when we're talking about divorce and remarriage. And so in Matthew 5:32, Jesus says, if a man puts away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication. No, in other words, so if you strike that phrase out, so she didn't commit fornication. So whosoever shall put away his wife causes her to commit adultery. And whoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. So a man just puts his wife away. Well, she's going to seek a partner elsewhere from someone else. She's going to seek that companionship. And so he has put her in the predicament. He has put her in a very dangerous, tenuous position where she's likely to commit adultery. And even the person who married her would also be guilty of adultery. But when you put the exception clause in, there's one exception to that rule. If she has committed fornication, then he's not causing her to commit adultery, right? She's already guilty of this. He's not the cause of it because she was already guilty of this sexual sin. She was guilty of fornication, all right? And we've talked about divorce and remarriage many times in the past. I think that's clear. The companion verse to that almost says exactly the same thing. In Matthew 19:9, this is probably the better known verse. Matthew 19:9, I say to you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. Again, if you struck the exception clause out, it would say, whosoever shall put away his wife and marry another commits adultery. He's bound to this woman, and he marries someone else. He's bound to this woman. That's adultery by scriptural definition. And whoever marries her that is put away doth commit adultery. And so that would be the situation. But if you put the exception back in, if she has committed fornication, then he does not commit adultery when he puts her away and marries someone else. Okay? So, what about this fornication? I think contextually it's clearly the physical act of sexual sin, actual physical contact. While we're in Matthew 5, so Matthew 5:32, all right? Back up in that text. Open your scriptures in that text. Back up to verse 27. Now you remember this is all within the Matthew 5, 6, and 7. That's all Sermon on the Mount business, right? In verse 27, Matthew 5:27, ye have heard that it was said of them old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say to you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee, and so on it goes. So what about this adultery in the heart? Rita?
To me, that's the same language used in 1 John 3:15. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer.
Yeah.
So we know that it's not physical murder,
Right.
but it's still called.
That's real good. Rita mentions 1 John 3:15. Whoever hates his brother is guilty of murder. Well, not literal murder, but he has that in it. He has that disposition of heart. And I think that's the same thing with this adultery in the heart. It's not real adultery, it's adultery in the heart. So here's the dilemma. If a man looking on another woman or looking at pornography is justification for divorce and remarriage, you got a huge problem. And you have to imagine that God in His wisdom would never have set us up for such an unworkable situation. So a man and his wife are walking down the street, and another woman passes by. And the wife says, I think you just looked at that woman. I think you just lusted after that woman. Oh, I didn't. Honest, I didn't. I really didn't. I didn't. What woman? I think you looked at her. I think you lusted after her. I'm getting a divorce. I have grounds for a divorce. Can you imagine how unworkable that would be? God in His wisdom would not ever put us, I think, in such a straight jacket as that. That just would be impossible to regulate. And so this fornication that is necessary in order to have a scriptural divorce, put your unfaithful mate away. The fornication must be actual, literal, physical contact. It's not just adultery in the heart, although that's a sin. It's clearly a sin. We're not. Please understand, we're not saying that that's okay. We're not saying that that's not a sin. It is a sin. It'll damn a soul to hell for sure. But it is not the grounds for a scriptural divorce and remarriage. Are we good on it? Everybody good on that? Any thoughts or comments? Okay. So again, here obviously we have the literal use of fornication. Here's so I'm just going to kind of go through in order the places we find this word in the New Testament. We probably won't get to all of them, but we'll just talk a number. And by the way, my intention is to cover a lesson a week here on this in this subject. John 8:41, ye do the deeds of your father. Then said they to him, we be not born of fornication. We have one Father, even God. Well, here's our word again, fornication. Look how Jesus' objectors used the word. We be not born of fornication. He would say, you do the deeds of your father. We be not born of fornication, they said. And so clearly fornication in its understood sense is that could produce illegitimate birth, right? It's not just thinking in your head. It's actually doing something that could result in illegitimate birth. And so the Jews, they understood the meaning of the word porneia, fornication. It's that which could produce illegitimate birth. And their objection was, no, we're not illegitimately born. We're not born of fornication. We have one Father, even God. So again, you see the real meaning of the word there. Acts 15. Remember in Acts 15, this was the meeting in Jerusalem. There was a big contention. Remember, there were Jews coming out of Jerusalem and going about, and they were going to places where there were new Gentile converts. Paul and Barnabas were working at the church in Antioch of Syria. And these Judaizing teachers, we refer to them, these Jews came from Jerusalem and said, these Gentiles, these Gentile men are going to have to be circumcised like Jewish men are, or they're not going to be right with God. And so that was a big, huge contention. And so Paul and Barnabas went down to Jerusalem, and they took some others with them, but they went there not to decide the issue, not to have a voting conference or anything of the sort. They went down there just basically to put a stop to this. We want this to be stopped. And so they went down there, and it wasn't a voting conference. Paul knew the truth on this before he even ever went down there. But it says in Acts 15, verse 20, this was the conclusion after they had met and talked. The conclusion was that we write unto them, that is the Gentile converts, that they abstain from pollutions of idols and from fornication and from things strangled and from blood. That ye abstain, and the letter said that ye abstain from meats offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, from fornication, from which if ye keep yourselves, you shall do well. So here's our word, keep yourself from fornication. And in the actual letter, they repeat that exact wording, of course. Well, look at this. Look at what they told them to do. What should the Gentiles do? Abstain from the pollutions of idols. Well, what were the pollutions of idols? Well, here they identify that as the meats offered to idols. So abstain from those pollutions of idols. Abstain from the meats offered to idols. Abstain from fornication. From blood. They mention blood. Things strangled. Fornication. Everything in that list, with the exception of, if you're just trying to figure out, would the fornication be literal or physical? A literal physical fornication, or would it be just a figurative, spiritual kind of fornication? Well, everything in that list is literal and physical, right? The meat offered idols, the things strangled, the animals that hadn't been properly bled. Abstain from these things, the text goes on to say, because they all constitute an offense to your Jewish brethren. And from fornication. Well, it's interesting, I think, if you notice the reference to idols and fornication. Idols and fornication. We know, and plenty of historical documentation to the fact, that in the pagan idolatrous temples, one of the things that was pervasive was prostitution. They would engage in acts of fornication in the idol's temple. There were prostitutes on hand for that purpose. They actually called the commission of sexual sin fornication. They called that a rite of religious service, if you can imagine such perversion as that. And so clearly the fornication that they're talking about here is the engaging in the sex act in the pagan temple and calling it service to God or service to the idol. I think that's very clear contextually that that's what they had in mind. You Gentile converts, you don't have to be circumcised. That was what the meeting was about. That's what all the controversy was about. You don't have to be circumcised, but you do have to do this, right? And so they instructed the Gentile converts in that way. It's repeated in chapter 21, verse 25. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. Just repeating the same message again. Clearly here, fornication was that, as we said, unauthorized sexual activity involving actual physical contact. I think we're seeing that working definition bears out. Romans chapter 1, verse 29. In this context, Paul was describing the pagan world of the first century. He says, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, the list goes on. Just use that, we just put that verse up here to draw out our word. So the pagan Gentile world was guilty of all kinds of sin. They were guilty of fornication. Do you remember what the verses just before this are describing? Anybody? Without looking. What is Romans 1, right before this statement where he mentions their fornication? What does it condemn? Homosexuality. Look at that. Now open up to Romans chapter 1. In Romans chapter 1, verse 26. For this cause God gave them up to vile affections, for even the women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, to do the things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication. So the fornication that was mentioned in the previous verses leading up to this was the sin of homosexuality. Homosexuality is a form of fornication. It's a sexual sin. It's an unauthorized sexual sin. It involves actual physical contact. Right? And so homosexuality is fornication. So fornication is sort of a broad term. We're going to see even more here in a minute of terms that fit under this umbrella of fornication. But when it's unauthorized sexual activity that involves actual physical contact, it is fornication. And it could be of a person who's married and having sexual intercourse with someone they're not married to. It could be of two people who are not married having sexual intercourse. It could be of homosexuals engaging in sexual activity. That's fornication. And so, again, imagine that fornication is the big all-encompassing term that includes all sins of a physical sexual nature. Within that broader circle would be fornication. Fornication is the broad term. Within that would be homosexuality. Within that would be adultery, in so much as adultery identifies a married person engaging in such action. We're going to see here in a minute that it would include the sin of incest. And so fornication is the big broad term. Other terms fit within it. They're sort of subsets of the larger whole of fornication. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 5, verse 1. it is reported commonly that there is fornication among you. And such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles, that one should have his father's wife. Now, I think we're all familiar with 1 Corinthians 5. And the church at Corinth, of course, was being strongly rebuked here because they weren't dealing with this man. This man was engaged in sinful activity and they were just looking the other way. And Paul is rebuking them for that in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. But here, this man's sin was fornication, specifically that he had his father's wife. And so, again, that would suggest to us that incestuous relationships fit within this broader umbrella term of fornication. Okay? So, again, I think we see over and over again, it bears out our definition. Fornication is unlawful sexual activity involving actual physical contact between persons. Thoughts or comments? Anybody? I don't want to stifle conversation here. Got anything to add? All right, 1 Corinthians 6, verses 13 and 18. Meats for the belly and the belly for meats, but God shall destroy both it and them. Now the body is not for fornication, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Flee fornication. Every sin that a man doeth is without the body, but he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. I think clearly here we see that the term is being used in, it's not just what I do in my brain, it's not just what I think about, it's what I do with my body, right? And so this bears out the definition of actual physical contact. You know, it's not just that a man lusts after a woman or a woman after a man for that matter. It's not just illicit thoughts in the mind, although those are wrong, those are sinful, and we'll see that. Some of the other works of the flesh will identify that. But fornication properly involves actual physical activity and contact. And I think the emphasis on it's something done with your body bears that out. Thoughts or comments? Anybody? All right, let's keep moving ahead. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 2. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife and let every woman have her own husband. And so God's plan for fulfilling the sexual needs of human beings is the marriage relationship. And so one of the purposes of the marriage relationship is to fulfill those desires in men and women. The text there in 1 Corinthians 7 goes on to describe that. And that husbands and wives should be mindful of the needs of their marriage partners. A very distinct reason for marriage, it's not the only reason for marriage, but a distinct reason for marriage given here is to avoid fornication. That's clearly the physical sex act, right? And so we are created with such desires, and God has provided a means for the satisfaction of such desires in the marriage relationship. I think no doubt here that it's talking about actual, literal, physical contact. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 8. Neither let us commit fornication as some of them committed and fell in one day 23,000. Paul's talking about the Israelites here. Lessons to be learned from the Israelites. Anybody remember what the episode was here that he has reference to? This is from Numbers 25. And in Numbers 25, we just recently talked about it. We just recently read about this in our daily Bible readings. The children of Israel were wanting to pass through the land of Moab. Balak, the king of the Moabites, didn't want to let them pass through, but he was afraid of them. They were a huge mass of people, and they had an enormous number of fighting men. And so he tried to get the prophet Balaam to state a curse on the Israelites. Tried 3 different times to get Balaam to curse the Israelites. God wouldn't let him do it, and every time Balaam actually ended up blessing the Israelites. The Old Testament text in Numbers 25 doesn't give us the details, but a couple of references in the New Testament fill in the blanks for us. And apparently what Balaam did, he wanted the reward that the king Balak was offering, and he couldn't voice a curse upon the Israelites. God wouldn't allow him to do that. But apparently what he did do is, I can't curse them. God won't let me curse them, but I can tell you what to do. I can give you some advice, and God will curse them himself if you do this. Get them to commit fornication with your women and get them to worship your idols. And the Israelites did. The Israelites committed fornication with the Moabite women, and a whole lot of them died as a result, as a punishment from God. But this fornication that he's talking about there, referencing that historical event in the case of the Israelite, the fornication there is obviously, literally committing sexual intercourse with those Moabitish women. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 21. And lest I come again, my God will humble me among you, and that I shall bewail many which have sinned already and have not repented of the uncleanness and fornication and lasciviousness which they have committed. Here's our word again. And Paul was concerned that a lot of those who had engaged in such sins would not repent of the sins they had committed. There's a couple other words mentioned here, uncleanness and lasciviousness. And we're going to look at those as works of the flesh coming up. But one of the problems is people get involved in these kinds of sins and they don't want to give them up. People get involved in these kinds of sins and they don't want to repent of them. And Paul said, I'm worried I'm going to come there and I'm going to find out that many of you who've been engaged in these sins have not repented of these sins. I think it's interesting that specifically the sin of fornication, and you know this well, people come up with all manner of excuses to excuse it away so that they can continue in this sin. Specifically, people will argue all different kinds. I mean, they'll strain to develop every possible explanation as to why they can continue in an unscriptural marriage, for instance. Well, that unscriptural marriage is fornication, but they don't want to leave that unscriptural marriage. They want to continue in that sin. That's not new. Paul was worried that when he got to Corinth, he would find people who would not repent of these kinds of sins. All right? Ephesians 5, verse 3. But fornication and uncleanness or covetousness, let it not once be named among you as becometh saints. Here's our word again. We're just going right down through the New Testament, looking where we find this word used. I think the interesting part of this one is pretty clear, but notice, fornication is not becoming to saints. Yeah, we've talked about that sort of terminology before. It's not becoming. A woman wears a new dress, and it really doesn't fit well and doesn't even look good. And so she presses her husband, and he's in a spot. If he gives an honest answer, she's probably going to get mad at him. But he says something, well, it's just not becoming to you. That dress is just not becoming to you. He means it doesn't look good on you, right? Well, that's what sins like this, they don't look good on people who call themselves Christians. It's not becoming to those who are saints. And that's not hard to understand. But you could say that really about all sins, but when we commit sins of this kind, and people in our realm of influence know this, it doesn't look good on a person who calls himself a Christian to engage in these kinds of sins. And Paul says for that reason, there's lots of reasons to avoid fornication, but one of the things that ought to motivate us to stay pure in these matters is to do otherwise doesn't look good among the saints. Colossians 3, verse 5. Colossians 3, verse 5 says, Mortify therefore your members which upon the earth, fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry. We just recently studied in Colossians. There's our word. And I always thought it was interesting that in Colossians he uses the word mortify. That's not a word that we would use typically these days, but it means put to death. Put an end to it. Put it to death, all these kinds of sins. Fornication there, in a context, again, is literal fornication. 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 3. For this is the will of God, even your sanctification, that you should abstain from fornication. Again, talking about motivation, reasons why we would want to avoid this sin. It is the will of God. This is the will of God, that you should abstain from fornication. We talk a lot of times about the fact that God's will is designed for our blessing. It's for our good. God didn't just make rules to see if He could make rules and we could keep them. He made rules that He knew because He made us. He designed us. He understands us better than we understand ourselves. He made rules that He knew were in our best interest. And so this, like all other rules of God, abstain from fornication. It's the will of God. Well, it's God's will because He knows what's best for us. We're not helping ourselves. If you think about it, you realize that sins of a sexual nature typically produce horrendous, heartbreaking consequences to people engaged in them. And so God doesn't want us to do that because He knows what's best for us. All right? And we ought to understand that. I think we do, because all of us understand the heartbreak that has resulted from such sinning. Jude 7, we just recently read this in our Sunday morning class. Even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Here's fornication, but if it's referencing Sodom and Gomorrah, and it even mentions going after strange flesh, I think that really identifies that he's talking here about the sin of homosexuality, but he calls it fornication. So that again goes to our definition and usage of this terminology. And again, so I think a really helpful thing to remember is sort of to remember fornication is the big, broad area that defines sexual sins, physical contact involving unlawful sexual activity. Homosexuality is in there. Incest is in there. Adultery is in there. Adultery would be when a married person is having unlawful sexual contact with another person. And so I think if we don't take anything else away from our study of this terminology, envision that. Envision fornication is the big broad term and others fit within it. Wait. I think so, but we don't find that used in the New Testament. We do in the Old Testament. We do read the condemnation of bestiality in the Old Testament. I don't think I can think of a New Testament reference, but I think Wade is right. Bestiality, which you don't even like to think about, but it would fit in there too as a form of fornication because, again, it is unlawful, unauthorized physical contact. Other thoughts? Okay. All right. So finally, we just got a few minutes left. The word fornication is mentioned a bunch of times in the book of Revelation. So open to the book of Revelation and let's just look real quickly. Because here I think, I really believe that all of the references that we've looked at so far are of the literal kind of fornication. But I think in Revelation we see it used both ways. So let's look real quickly at Revelation chapter 2 verse 14. In chapter 2 verse 14... the Lord is addressing the church at Pergamos. He says, I have a few things against thee because thou hast there them that hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit fornication. Well, we talked about that a minute ago, right? That was literal, right? Balaam said to Balak, get them to worship your idols, get them to have sexual intercourse with your women. God will curse them. And so, again, that's one of the places we get that additional information about what was wrong with what Balaam did. But clearly that's literal fornication. Verse 20, speaking to the church at Thyatira, he says, notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed to idols. You see again this connection between idol worship and fornication. We know often in the worship of idols they had temple prostitutes and they engaged in sexual intercourse and they called it worship. This Jezebel woman was encouraging such activity. I think even in the verse when it links the fornication there with the eating of things sacrificed to idols. Obviously, the second part is literal, physical. I think the first part then would also be literal and physical. Verse 21, I gave her space to repent of her fornication, and she repented not. So I think again, this is probably literal. Look in chapter 9 at verse 21. Revelation 9, verse 21. Neither repented they of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts. Again, this is condemning the sins of the world in that first century time frame. I think because contextually it's linked with thefts and sorceries, those were things they literally, physically did. Probably a literal use there. Look at chapter 14, verse 8. In chapter 14, verse 8, there followed another angel saying, Babylon is fallen, the great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. So, depending on who you believe, we're not going to dive into a study of Revelation here, but depending on who you think Babylon is, Jerusalem or Rome, and of course there are varying interpretations of Revelation, but it's not talking about one person, it's talking about a nation of people and their fornication. Here it's figurative, I think, right? When it's describing the whole nation of people who were unfaithful. Look at chapter 17, verse 2. Revelation 17:2, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Again, the kings of the earth relative to the nation committing fornication, almost certainly figurative. Verse 4, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup of her hand, in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. That's really symbolic. That's a figurative usage of the terminology, right? Chapter 18, verse 3. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. Figurative, clearly figurative. Verse 9 of 18:9. The kings of the earth who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning, when God brings His judgment. But again, it's talking about nations, not individuals. It's got to be figurative. And this one last place here, chapter 19, verse 2. For true and righteous are His judgments, for He hath judged the great whore, which did corrupt the earth with her fornication, and hath avenged the blood of the servants at her hand. Again, God's judgment against a nation of people for their fornication. That's a figurative usage of the term. So, time-wise, it worked out pretty good. You get the idea. The word is used a lot. I think we understand it. Hopefully we do understand that. And I want us to take away the working definition, which has to be understood. I think it seems to me that it's increasingly important to have the right definition of this word fornication, because it comes up in questions about divorce and remarriage. And specifically, as we started out, the question is raised, what about adultery in the heart? What about a man who looks on a woman to lust after her? Can his wife divorce him for looking at another woman? No. It's a sin for him to look and lust after another woman, but it's not fornication. And so, that has become, I don't know if you're aware of it, but that's become a huge question. It's asked over and over again. And I've even known of preachers who advised women that they could divorce their husbands for this reason. I think that's wrong. And that's going to cause all kinds of additional complications. And it all goes to a failed understanding of the definition of the word. And so it's good to have that in mind. All right? Okay, so the word next week will be uncleanness. Uncleanness, as we continue to look at the works of the flesh. Thanks, everybody.